Soft piano fades in. The voice of an elderly man, calm, gentle, but heavy with memory. I used to think growing old would mean peace, a porch swing, a quiet cup of coffee, a few phone calls from the kids, "Hey Dad, how are you holding up?" But somewhere between paying their college tuition and signing the last mortgage check, something changed. They stopped calling to talk. They only called to ask. At first, it was little things. "Dad, can I borrow some money till payday? Dad, do you still have that spare car? Dad, do you think you could help us with the down payment?" And each time I said yes, because that's what fathers do. We give even when no one notices we're running out. There's an old saying, when your kids are young, you give them your time. When they're grown, they take your time and call it love. For a while, I believed that was enough. But love, I learned, should feel like warmth, not withdrawal. The last Thanksgiving we had together was 3 years ago. I roasted the turkey myself, just like their mother used to do. I set the table for 5, me, the 2 boys, my daughter, and her husband. But by noon, one called to say work ran late. Another texted, "Sorry, Dad, traffic's a mess." And my daughter, she didn't even text. I ate cold turkey that day alone. The gravy hardened, the candles melted down. And somewhere between the first and last bite, I realized I wasn't family anymore. I was an obligation. They came by at Christmas, though, not with hugs or stories, but with calculators. My oldest, Mark, asked, "Dad, do you still plan to leave the house to all of us equally?" He tried to sound casual, like it was small talk, but his wife's eyes, they were already measuring the drapes. My daughter Emily smiled, that sweet smile that once melted me when she was little. Now it felt rehearsed. "Dad," she said softly, "you know I've always taken care of you emotionally. Maybe the house should go to me. You can trust me." And my youngest, Luke, the quiet one, he didn't say much. He just looked uncomfortable, like he wanted to defend me but didn't know how. I remember sitting there, staring at the flickering lights on the Christmas tree. They used to shine so bright when the kids were small, when laughter filled the house and wrapping paper covered the floor. Now they look tired, like me. When they left, they forgot a few things: a half-empty bottle of wine, some dirty dishes, and a silence that echoed through the walls like an accusation. That night I went to the old study, the one filled with photos and dust. There's a picture of us at the lake. Emily on my shoulders, laughing. Mark teaching Luke how to fish. Their mother standing behind the camera, smiling, that gentle, proud smile that said, "We did it, we built a family." If she could see us now, I wondered, what would she say? The house creaked as the wind picked up. I sat down at my desk and opened the drawer where my will was kept. I hadn't looked at it in years. The lawyer had typed it neatly. "To my children I leave all that I own, to be shared equally." I remember signing it proudly back then. It felt like a promise. Now it felt like a lie, because love was never equal anymore. Not in giving, not in remembering. There's a line in the good book that says, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." I think I finally understood it that night. My treasure wasn't my house. It wasn't the savings account or the old Buick in the garage. It was the small moments I thought we'd always have. The dinners, the laughter, the late-night talks on the porch. And somehow I'd lost all of it piece by piece while they were still alive. So I picked up a pen, took a deep breath, and whispered to the empty room. "My kids came for my money, not my company." The words hit harder than I expected, because saying them out loud made them real. I closed the will and looked out the window. Across the street I saw Martha, my neighbor, trimming her roses even though the night was cold. She looked up, waved, and smiled, that simple, honest smile that doesn't ask for anything back. Funny, isn't it? Sometimes the people who check on you aren't family. They're just kind enough to act like one. I knew then that I'd have to make a change, not out of anger, not out of revenge, but because I wanted what was left of me, my time, my care, my love, to mean something, something real. Maybe when they hear the truth one day, they'll understand. Maybe they'll hate me. Maybe they'll finally remember who their father was. Either way, this time they'll have to listen. There was a time when this house was louder than life itself. Back then, silence was something I prayed for. A moment to rest between the clatter of dishes and the stampede of small feet racing down the hallway. Now I would trade anything for that noise again. I still remember the smell of pancakes on Saturday mornings. The kind that stuck to the air, sweet, buttery, with a hint of cinnamon because your mother liked to overdo it. Mark would always fight for the first batch, even if it was half burnt. Emily, she'd sprinkled too many chocolate chips, pretending it was for Luke. And Luke, quiet as ever, would sit at the corner, grinning, his cheeks covered in sugar dust. Your mother used to hum while she cooked. Not a real song, just that soft tune she carried when she was happy. It wrapped around the kitchen like sunlight. That kitchen. I can still see the yellow curtains fluttering against the morning breeze. The paint chipped where someone once threw a spoon in a family argument, and the faint stain on the wall from the time Luke tried to make volcano spaghetti. You don't forget things like that. They live inside the house like ghosts that never meant to haunt. When the kids were little, I thought fatherhood was about providing. The bills, the braces, the bikes. But looking back now, I realize it was about being there. Those golden days were built from moments that seemed ordinary. Teaching Emily to ride her bike in the driveway. Watching Mark score his first touchdown under the autumn lights. Luke falling asleep on my chest while we watched old westerns on the couch. Each memory was a small brick in something sacred, a kind of quiet love we never had to say out loud. Your mother used to say, "Someday they'll all grow up and move out, and it'll be our time again." We used to dream of traveling. She wanted to see the Grand Canyon. I wanted to drive Route 66 in that rusty Ford we could never afford to fix. But life doesn't always wait for you to get ready. One winter, she caught a cough that wouldn't leave. By spring, it had a name we couldn't fight. I remember her last morning, how the world outside looked unfairly beautiful, how the snow melted slow, dripping from the eaves like the clock refusing to stop. She whispered, "Promise me you'll keep them together." And I did. God help me, I tried. After she was gone, I filled the house with noise, not laughter but survival. I fixed the roof, repainted the porch, planted her favorite marigolds by the mailbox. I told myself that if the place looked alive, maybe I wouldn't feel so hollow. The kids came home often at first, holidays, birthdays, a few long weekends. They brought stories from college, from work, from new lives blooming far beyond our little street. I was proud, truly proud. They were everything we had hoped for. But pride and presence aren't the same thing. I remember one evening, Mark showed up with a new watch and a new attitude. He talked fast, about promotions and investments like time itself was chasing him. I listened, even when he forgot to ask how I was doing. Emily started wearing perfume that filled the room before she entered. She looked more like her mother each year, but her laughter carried something sharper, as if the world had already disappointed her too many times. And Luke, my gentle boy, he grew into a man who avoided eye contact, always in a hurry, as if slowing down might make him remember too much. The house began to change with them. Fewer plates on the table, fewer coats hanging by the door. The porch light burned longer at night, not because anyone was coming home late, but because I couldn't bring myself to turn it off. Sometimes I'd find old notes they'd written me. Crayon hearts, shaky letters that said, "Love you, Dad." They were tucked in drawers behind photo frames, little fossils from a time when love didn't need permission. I'd trace my fingers over the paper, feeling the tiny indentations where their pencils pressed too hard. And I'd wonder, at what age does "I love you" become something we outgrow? Neighbors used to say I was lucky. 3 beautiful kids, a good house, a steady job, they'd tell me. And I'd nod, smile, say I was blessed. Because I was. Because I am. But blessings, I've learned, can fade quietly, not in anger or betrayal at first, just in distance. A mile here, a forgotten birthday there, a silence that stretches too long to fix. One afternoon, years later, I found myself standing at the window, watching the sunlight spill over the empty yard. The treehouse still stood, crooked but proud. The swings creaked softly, moved by a wind that didn't care who was missing. The marigolds bloomed by the mailbox just like she wanted, bright, stubborn, refusing to fade. I stood there for a long time, listening to the sound of my own breathing, the faint hum of traffic in the distance, and a thought that came like a whisper I didn't want to hear. Maybe the golden days aren't lost. Maybe they just stopped waiting for me to notice they were gone. It didn't happen in a single moment. There was no argument, no slammed door, no storm. Just a slow fading, like sunlight shrinking off the porch at the end of a long day. The first sign came on a Tuesday. I had spent the morning fixing the fence that Mark said he'd help me with. He promised he'd be there by 9. By 11, the coffee had gone cold. By noon, I realized he wasn't coming. When I called, he sounded distracted, papers rustling, voices in the background. "Sorry, Dad, meeting stacked up. You understand, right?" Of course I did. That's what fathers do. We understand even when it hurts. Emily started calling less too. Her messages turned shorter, sharper, full of exclamation marks but missing warmth. Busy week, love you. Can't talk now, meeting later. I'd play her old voicemails sometimes, the ones where she'd giggle halfway through a story. Now even her laughter felt scheduled, like something she penciled in between deadlines. Luke still texted once in a while, just one-liners. All good, Dad. Yeah, works fine. He was the quiet one, always had been. But now his quiet felt different, colder, like a room that used to be warm but nobody opened the curtains anymore. There were other signs, little things that only someone who loves deeply would notice. Christmas cards stopped coming with handwritten notes. Birthdays turned into digital reminders. The grandkids, Mark's two boys, started calling me sir instead of grandpa. I told myself it was manners, but deep down I knew it was distance, wearing polite clothes. I used to keep a pot of soup simmering on Sundays the way your mother did. The smell of herbs and onions would fill the whole house, drifting out the open window. I hoped it would pull them in like old times, but the doorbell never rang. Instead, the phone would buzz, Dad, can we reschedule dinner? Or sometimes nothing at all. The house felt different then. Not empty, just indifferent. The kind of quiet that doesn't comfort you anymore, only reminds you what's missing. One night, it rained harder than I'd seen in years. Thunder rolled like the sky was trying to shake something loose. I sat in the living room, the lamp flickering, watching the water crawl down the window pane. It made trails that reminded me of road maps, roads leading away from this house. The power went out, so I lit a candle. The flame shivered in the dark, throwing soft light across the family photos on the wall. I found myself looking at each face, tiny moments frozen in time. Mark holding his first baseball trophy. Emily in her prom dress, eyes bright and unbroken. Luke with a missing tooth, grinning like the world was his. And me standing beside them all, younger, stronger, believing that love was something permanent. The candle burned low before I realized I'd been talking to those pictures for an hour, asking questions they couldn't answer. A week later, I received a letter from the bank, something about the house title. Mark had just checked if everything was in order, he said. He offered to help handle the paperwork, so I wouldn't be stressed. He said it kindly, but the way he said handle made me uneasy, as if my home had become an asset instead of a memory. That same month, Emily brought up the future. She said maybe I should sell the place, move somewhere simpler, somewhere with support. I knew what she meant. Retirement homes. The kind that smell like bleach and loneliness. Luke didn't say much about it, but I could tell he agreed. He didn't look me in the eyes when they left that evening. The next morning, I sat on the porch with my coffee, watching the mail truck pass by without stopping. The air was crisp, but my hands still shook. I looked across the street. Martha was watering her flowers again. She waved, smiled like she always did. For a moment, I almost waved back, but I didn't. I just sat there holding the mug until it went cold, thinking about how strange it is that kindness can live right across the street, while love can move 1,000 miles away. By summer, the calls came once a week, then once a month, then only when something needed signing. At first, I tried to reach out, sent photos of the garden, little jokes, even a few old recipes your mother wrote down. No one replied, so I stopped sending them, and when I stopped, no one noticed. I began talking to myself more, not out loud, not at first, just in my head, small conversations I imagined having with them. Mark, how's work? Emily, are you sleeping enough? Luke, remember that fishing trip? But memory is a cruel substitute for presence. It keeps you company, but it doesn't keep you warm. One afternoon, while trimming the marigolds by the mailbox, I overheard Martha telling the mailman about her son. He calls every night, she said, smiling. They say the same things, but it's enough. It keeps me alive. When she went back inside, I looked down at my hands. They were trembling, not from age, but from something heavier. A quiet realization that the promise I made to their mother to keep them together had turned into a prayer I said to no one. The distance didn't arrive like a storm. It came like fog, soft, invisible, until one morning I couldn't see them anymore. And that's when I knew love doesn't always end with a goodbye. Sometimes it just stops calling back. It was a Thursday in early spring. The kind of morning that smells like rain before it falls, heavy, gray, uncertain. My 68th birthday. I woke early, as I always do. Habit, I suppose. The body remembers even when the heart forgets. I made myself a simple breakfast: 2 eggs, toast, black coffee. The pan hissed when the butter touched it, and for a moment the sound almost felt like company. The house looked cleaner than usual that day. I tidied up the night before, not because I expected guests, but because a part of me still hoped someone might come. The old dining table sat ready, plates aligned, napkins folded the way your mother used to do. A single candle stood in the center. I didn't plan to light it, it just felt wrong to leave the table empty. By 9 the mail arrived. Bills, a flyer for car insurance. No card. I checked my phone. Nothing. I told myself it was early, that they were probably busy. People are always busy now. Busy has become the new way to say I forgot. By noon I'd finished fixing the broken latch on the shed door. It squeaked less now. It felt good to fix something, even if it was small. The phone buzzed once. A message from Mark. "Happy birthday, Dad. Big meeting today. Call you later." No later came. An hour after that, Emily sent a text with confetti emojis. No words, just pictures. It looked cheerful but somehow emptier than silence. Luke didn't message at all. Not that day, not the day after. The afternoon grew long and pale. A thin drizzle began to fall, the kind that makes the air smell like wet soil and old promises. I decided to bake a small cake. Your mother's recipe, lemon with a touch of vanilla. The scent filled the kitchen, warm and sharp at the same time, like memory insisting it still belonged here. I poured the batter carefully, listening to the rhythm of the rain against the window, a soft percussion keeping time with the ache in my chest. When the timer rang, I set the cake on the counter to cool. It looked lopsided, but it smelled like home. I stared at it for a long time, half expecting to hear a knock at the door or laughter spilling in from the porch. Nothing. Just the hum of the refrigerator, the kind of sound you only notice when you're alone. Around 6, I decided to light the candle after all. Just one. The flame wavered slightly, reflecting off the kitchen window, a small trembling thing trying its best to stay alive. I whispered the words I'd heard my kids say for years. "Make a wish, Dad." So I did. I wished for nothing grand, not wealth, not youth, not forgiveness. Just one simple thing for someone to remember without being reminded. I blew out the candle and the smoke rose in thin, lazy spirals, curling into the ceiling like a prayer that had forgotten its address. The doorbell rang just then. My heart leapt. When I opened the door, it wasn't any of them. It was Martha, the neighbor from across the street. Her coat was speckled with rain, and she held a small box wrapped in brown paper. "Thought you might like some pie," she said. "Apple just out of the oven." Her voice carried that unpolished kindness people don't fake. She didn't ask if anyone was coming. She didn't have to. I invited her in, and for the first time that day, the air felt less heavy. We sat at the table, two old souls sharing pie and silence. The rain softened to a mist, and the house began to hum again, a quiet, living hum that made the walls feel less hollow. She asked about the kids, and I smiled, said they were busy, doing well, the usual lies that sound better than the truth. She didn't press, just nodded and poured me another cup of tea. When she left, the evening had settled. The rain had stopped, but the world still smelled washed clean. She waved from her porch before going inside. That small gesture, simple, unspoken, meant more than all the birthday texts combined. I sat back at the table. The candle was cold now, its wax pooled in the dish like frozen time. The cake had gone untouched. I cut one slice, wrapped the rest, and wrote a small note. "Thank you for the pie, thought you might like a piece of cake in return." I left it by her door quietly, the way people do when they're too shy to admit they needed someone. When I came back inside, the phone buzzed again. A voicemail from Mark, his voice hurried, professional. "Sorry I missed your call, Dad. Hope it was a good day. Let's catch up soon." He hadn't noticed I never called. I sat there listening to it twice. The way lonely people replay old laughter, trying to fill the space where love used to live. Then I deleted it. The house went still again. The air smelled faintly of lemon and cooling wax. Outside, the wind brushed through the marigolds by the mailbox, their petals trembling but unbroken. And as I stood there, watching the last bit of light fade from the sky, I realized something quietly cruel. Forgetting doesn't always mean they stop caring. Sometimes it just means they stop seeing you as someone who could be missed. It was 2 days after my birthday when Martha came by again. I was on the porch, mending an old chair whose leg had given up after too many winters. The sun had started its slow descent, bleeding orange across the neighbors' rooftops. The air smelled faintly of lilac, her doing, no doubt. She grew them in neat rows along her fence, and the scent carried wherever the wind decided kindness was needed. She waved as she crossed the street, a pie tin in one hand, that same brown coat draped over her shoulders. "You never came for your dish," she said, smiling like it was an invitation to remember. I told her I meant to, that I'd been busy. We both knew that wasn't true. Martha had a way of sitting like she belonged anywhere she chose. She settled into the wicker chair beside me, its strands creaking softly beneath her, the fading sun caught in her silver hair. There was something unpretentious about her presence. She didn't fill the silence, she honored it. After a while, she nodded toward the empty yard. "You've kept it nice," she said. "Your marigolds look better than mine." I chuckled. "Yours are alive. That already puts them ahead." She smiled, and for a moment the air felt easier to breathe. We talked about simple things at first: the weather, the mail that kept getting mixed up, her cat who refused to sleep indoors. It was the kind of small talk that stays close to the surface, careful not to wake anything deeper. But grief has a scent, and kindness always finds it. After a pause, she asked, "How was your birthday?" I tried to answer lightly. "Oh, quiet," I said. "Just another Thursday." But my voice betrayed me. It cracked barely, but enough. Martha didn't say anything. She just looked at me in that way only people who have lost something can, without pity, without surprise, only understanding. "My husband's birthdays were quiet too near the end," she said softly. She looked past the lilacs into the dimming sky. "People think loneliness is about being alone. It's not. It's when you have stories left to tell, and no one left who remembers the same ones." Her words settled over me like the evening air, heavy but strangely warm. "I used to think," I began, then stopped. It had been a long time since anyone had waited for me to finish a sentence. "I used to think family was a thing that stayed constant," I said finally. "You pour everything you have into them. You think love is something that can't be misplaced." She turned toward me, her hands folded loosely in her lap. "Love doesn't get misplaced," she said. "People do." The porch light flickered on, a faint hum cutting through the crickets. I stared at the glow between us, the way it softened the edges of her face, the way it made the night feel less like an ending. "You ever wonder," I asked quietly, "what happens if the people you loved forget who you are before you're gone?" She was silent for a moment. Then she said, "Then you remind them, not with words, with what you leave behind." There was something about that line that stirred me, as if it reached back into all the quiet places I'd been living lately and opened a window. "What do you mean?" I asked. She leaned back, eyes following a slow, drifting moth around the porch light. "When George passed," she said, "our kids were too busy to come for the funeral. They sent flowers, messages, but no one showed up. I was angry at first. Then I realized anger doesn't change what people have forgotten. It just burns what you still have left." She looked at me then, steady, kind. "So I started writing letters to them," she said. "Not to make them feel guilty, just to remind them of who their father was. The man who fixed their bikes, sang off-key at church, taught them how to make soup when money was tight. I didn't send the letters, I just kept them." I frowned slightly. "What for?" "Because someday," she said, "when I'm gone, those letters will speak for me. People forget words you say to their faces. They remember the ones you whisper when you're no longer there to defend them." The idea landed quietly, but it didn't leave. Something about it felt right, too right, like truth wearing a familiar coat. "I don't know if my kids would care to listen," I said. "Then talk anyway," she replied. "They might not be ready to hear you now, but one day they'll be ready to miss you." Her eyes softened. "And when that day comes, make sure they find more than silence." We sat there a long while after that, watching the last bit of sunlight slip away. The air cooled, thick with the smell of wet earth and lilacs. Somewhere down the street a dog barked, then stopped. The kind of stillness that only happens when two people have said enough. Before leaving, Martha placed her hand on my arm. A light touch, but it lingered like warmth stays on wood long after the sun's gone. "Write something," she said. "Anything, for them or for yourself. You'll know when the time is right." Then she smiled and walked back across the street, the sound of her shoes tapping softly against the wet pavement, until it faded into the kind of silence that no longer hurt as much as it used to. I stayed on the porch long after she was gone. The moth still circled the light, relentless, faithful. I thought about her words, about the power of leaving something behind that spoke when you couldn't. Inside, the house waited, dark, expectant. I could almost hear your mother's voice, faint but familiar, whispering the same promise I'd made long ago: keep them together. Maybe I hadn't failed entirely. Maybe I just hadn't found the right way to speak yet. I stood, joints aching, and went inside. The air smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Somewhere deep in the study, behind the drawer where the will sat untouched, there was an empty notebook. The kind your mother used to buy in pairs. One for her recipes, one for me, though I never knew what to write in it. Until now. That night, for the first time in years, I began to write. Not a letter, not a plea, just the beginning of a truth I'd been too afraid to say aloud. It happened on a Sunday, a gray, indifferent day that smelled faintly of damp wood and reheated coffee. Mark had called the night before, his voice brisk, efficient. "Dad, we should all get together, to talk about arrangements." He didn't say what kind. He didn't have to. The tone already gave it away. By noon the house was ready, not because I wanted it to be, but because old habits are hard to kill. The table was polished, the chairs aligned. The same chairs that once scraped the floor during birthday parties and homework nights. Now they waited like witnesses. The first to arrive was Emily. Her car hummed into the driveway, too new, too shiny for this old house. She stepped out wearing a tailored coat, her perfume trailing behind her like a statement. "Hi, Dad," she said, air-kissing the room instead of me. She glanced around, wrinkling her nose slightly. "You really should think about redecorating. It feels heavy in here." Heavy, that was one word for it. Mark came next, phone glued to his ear. He didn't hang up when he walked in, just nodded, gave me a half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. When he finally ended the call, he clapped me on the shoulder. "Good to see you, old man. We'll get through this quick, okay?" Quick, as if time itself was a nuisance. Luke was last. He came alone, no words, just a nod. He still had that quiet about him, but it had changed. It wasn't shyness anymore, it was distance carefully folded into politeness. I poured coffee for everyone, the smell of roasted beans filling the room, trying to make peace where none existed. They barely touched it. Mark sat at the head of the table, my seat. He spread out a folder, papers spilling like a deck of cards. Emily placed her phone beside her mug, the screen lighting up every few seconds. Luke stared at the table, tracing invisible lines with his finger. The rain outside picked up, drumming steady against the roof. The sound reminded me of the years when that noise meant comfort. Now it only filled the silence between us. "So," Mark began, clearing his throat, "we've been thinking about how to make things easier for you." He paused, glancing at Emily for approval. She nodded, that practiced professional nod like she was closing a deal. "Maybe it's time to consider downsizing," he continued. "You don't need all this space, and it's a lot to maintain. We could help sell the house, get you something smaller, cozier, something near a care facility." Emily chimed in, voice smooth, rehearsed. "Mark's right, Dad, it's practical. We could handle the paperwork, the finances, everything." Her words came with the precision of someone signing checks for a stranger. I sat still, hands folded in my lap. The smell of rain mixed with the faint scent of lemon polish. It was suddenly hard to breathe. When I didn't respond right away, Mark leaned forward. "You're not getting any younger," he said gently, as though the softness could hide the cruelty. "This is for your own good." For a moment, I thought of Martha's words. People forget words you say to their faces. They remember the ones you whisper when you're gone. I wondered what words I'd leave behind after this. Emily reached across the table, touched my hand lightly. Her nails were cold, her smile colder. "Dad, don't take this the wrong way. We just want what's best for everyone." Everyone. A word stretched too far. In that sentence, I wasn't part of everyone. I was the obstacle between them and convenience. Luke finally looked up. "Maybe we should let Dad decide," he said quietly. It was the smallest act of courage, but it felt like the first human thing in the room. Mark exhaled sharply. "Luke, be realistic. You think he can handle everything alone?" He turned to me. "You fell last year in the garage, remember? You didn't even tell us until weeks later." I wanted to tell him I didn't call because I knew he wouldn't pick up, but what good would that do now? The rain outside turned to a downpour, a steady rush against the windows that blurred the world beyond. The room felt smaller, the air thicker. The coffee had gone cold. Even the clock seemed to tick louder, like it wanted to remind us of all the time already lost. I finally spoke. "I appreciate your concern," I said. My voice came out steady, but it carried an ache I couldn't hide. "I'll think about it." Mark nodded, relieved, already reaching for his phone. "Good. I'll start talking to a realtor. There's no rush, of course. We'll make it smooth." Smooth. The word rolled off his tongue like oil. Emily smiled faintly. "Don't worry, Dad, we'll take care of everything." They didn't hear the way the word care cracked against the air. Luke lingered after the others stood. He hovered near the doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "You don't have to sell if you don't want to," he said softly. Then, after a pause, "They mean well. They just don't know how to love you right anymore." He looked ashamed, as if the truth itself were impolite. I nodded. "I know. And I did. That's what made it worse." When they finally left, the house felt heavier than before. Their voices still lingered, not the words themselves, but the tone, that sharp, transactional rhythm that families use when affection has turned into business. I sat back at the table, the papers still spread before me like pieces of a puzzle I didn't want to solve. Outside, the rain had slowed to a whisper. The last drop from the roof hit the porch with a small, final sound. I looked at the chair where Martha had sat just a few evenings ago. Her words returned, quiet but clear. "Talk anyway. They might not be ready to hear you now, but one day they'll be ready to miss you." My reflection wavered in the dark window pane. Older, smaller, but not broken yet. Maybe that's when I made the decision. Maybe right there, among the cold eyes and polite words. Something in me decided that silence would no longer be my legacy. The decision came quietly, not as a burst of anger nor a flash of revelation. It came the way dawn slips into the world, slow, certain, and impossible to turn away from once you've seen it. I woke before sunrise that morning. The sky still wore the last shade of night, that deep indigo that pretends it's still safe to dream. The house was cold. I could feel it in my knees, in the ache behind my fingers. Age has a way of speaking even when you don't. I boiled water for tea, no sugar, no lemon, just plain. The steam curled upward, ghost-like, brushing against my face. I stood there for a while, holding the cup with both hands, watching the faint fog of my breath mingle with the steam. Something about it felt like prayer. The folder sat on the kitchen table, the same one Mark had brought the week before, still filled with real estate brochures and financial options. I ran my thumb along its edge, feeling the sharpness of the paper. They had made their plans clear, to rearrange my life into something more manageable, more profitable, more convenient. But I'd already made mine. Around 9, I put on my old jacket, the one with the worn elbows and the faint scent of cedar that never left it, and drove to the law office downtown. The streets were slick from last night's rain, the sky still carrying the dull silver of early morning. The law office was small, quiet, tucked between a florist and a diner. When I opened the door, the scent of old paper and coffee greeted me. The receptionist, a young woman with tired eyes and a soft smile, looked up. "Morning, Mr. Warren," she said. "You're early." "I've had a lot of practice being early," I replied. She smiled politely and motioned toward the hallway. "Mr. Davis will see you now." Harold Davis had been my lawyer for over 20 years. He was older now, slower. His once dark hair turned the color of cigarette ash. When I stepped into his office, he stood to shake my hand. His grip firm, steady, the kind that carries both routine and respect. "Been a while," he said, gesturing for me to sit. I nodded. "Too long." The walls behind him were lined with certificates and photos, weddings, graduations, families smiling under perfect lighting. All the proof of people who believed order could keep love from unraveling. He took off his glasses and cleaned them with the edge of his sleeve. "So," he said, "you're ready to make some changes." I looked down at the folder I carried. Inside were 3 things: a new will handwritten in the quiet of last night, a sealed envelope, and a USB drive, small and unassuming but heavier than anything I'd ever held. "Yes," I said, "it's time." He read through the pages slowly, the paper rustling softly under his hands. "Are you sure about this, Tom?" He used my name the way only old friends do, gently, like a bridge between lives. "I've never been more sure," I said. "My children have their lives, their homes, their careers. They have each other, at least I hope they still do. What I've written here, it's not about punishment, it's about truth." He studied me for a long moment, the way doctors do before giving you news they can't take back. Then he nodded. "Sometimes truth is the only inheritance worth leaving." He slid the final page across the desk. "Sign here." The pen felt cool in my hand. My signature trembled slightly, not from doubt, but from the weight of everything it carried. Each stroke cut quietly through the years, separating who I'd been from who I had to become. When the last letter was written, I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. He reached for his stamp, pressed it down with a firm click. That sound, sharp, final, echoed through the room like a door closing gently behind me. Talked a little after that, about the weather, about how business had been slow, but beneath the small talk there was an unspoken understanding that this was not just legal work. It was an act of reclamation. Before I left, I placed the sealed envelope and the USB drive on his desk. "When the time comes," I said, "you'll know what to do with these." He nodded once. "I'll make sure it's handled exactly as you wrote." "Thank you, Harold." He hesitated. "You want your children to know beforehand?" "No," I said quietly. "This one's meant to speak when I no longer can." The drive home felt longer than usual. The clouds had broken by then, and sunlight spilled across the wet streets, making everything shimmer like the world was pretending it hadn't rained. I stopped at a red light, watched a young father cross the street holding his daughter's hand. She was laughing, skipping, her small backpack bouncing with every step. He looked down at her the way I once did, like she was the center of the world. The light turned green, but I didn't move right away. For a moment I just watched them disappear into the crowd, until they became another story the city swallowed whole. Back home, the house greeted me with its familiar stillness. The clock ticked in the hallway. The marigolds outside swayed under a lazy breeze. I set my jacket on the chair, sat at the kitchen table where everything began. The folder was gone now. The will was signed. There was nothing left to decide. I reached for my notebook, the one I had started the night Martha told me to write. On the first page I had written only one line. "They may forget what I said, but they will not forget what I meant." I turned to a new page and began again. The pen moved slower this time, but steadier, as if it finally knew where it was going. Outside, the wind carried the faint scent of lilac across the yard, and somewhere in the distance, a voice I hadn't heard in years, my wife's, maybe, seemed to whisper through the air. "You did right, Tom." I didn't answer. I just kept writing. The days after I signed the papers felt strangely lighter. Not joyful, no, joy is something you feel when the future still belongs to you. This was different. This was the quiet that comes when you've stopped struggling against the truth. I spent the week putting things in order. Not the way lawyers mean it, documents, signatures, legal bindings. I mean the kind of order that lives inside a home. The kind only the heart understands. The mornings were colder now, early spring giving way to the first whisper of summer. When I opened the windows, the air came in crisp and smelling faintly of soil and cut grass. Birdsong drifted from the trees beyond the fence. For the first time in a long while, I listened. I started with the attic. Dust thick as memory hung in the light, turning every step into a small storm. Boxes stacked like quiet witnesses to the years we'd built together. Each one labeled in your mother's handwriting, soft cursive, slightly tilted. I opened one marked Christmas. Inside, ornaments wrapped in old newspaper, brittle from age. A tiny porcelain angel with a chipped wing. The same one Emily dropped when she was 5 and cried for an hour. I smiled, holding it carefully as though it could still break. I set it aside, not to throw away, but to leave in the open, so that someone someday would see it and understand we once had warmth. Next came the drawers in the study. Receipts, photographs, letters half written. The air smelled of old paper and ink, that dry, metallic scent of time passing through your fingers. Among them I found your mother's recipe cards, faded, splattered with oil stains and sugar, her handwriting still alive on every line. I ran my fingers across the ink, the way you might trace someone's face in the dark. I gathered them into a box, tied it with twine, and wrote on the lid, "For whoever remembers love in flavor." In the evenings I walked the house slowly, touching the walls, the railings, the corners that still carried laughter in their wood. Not nostalgia, just acknowledgement. You don't mourn the past when you can still hear it breathing. Sometimes I'd pause by the porch window, watching the lights from across the street flicker on one by one. Martha's house glowed soft and steady, a kind of warmth that didn't ask questions. I'd see her silhouette moving through the kitchen, feeding the cat, washing dishes, humming to a tune no one else knew, and it calmed me knowing that when I was gone, someone kind would still be standing that close to where I once lived. 3 days before the new will was filed, I called her. She answered on the second ring. "Tom, you all right?" Her voice carried that mixture of surprise and worry that only comes from people who genuinely expect nothing from you. "I'm fine," I said. "I was wondering if you could stop by later this week. I have something for you." "Of course," she said. "Do I need to bring anything?" "No, just yourself. When she came, it was just after sunset. The air smelled faintly of lilac and rain. I had brewed tea, Earl Grey, her favorite. We sat in the living room, the kind of quiet that doesn't need conversation filling it. I handed her an envelope, plain sealed, her name written across it in ink that still looked wet. She looked puzzled. "What's this?" "Something for later," I said. "Not now. Promise me you won't open it until it feels right." She studied me for a moment, eyes narrowing with the intuition that age gives you. "Tom, are you—" "I'm fine," I interrupted gently. "Just making sure the right things end up in the right hands." We talked after that, about gardens, the neighborhood, the way the seasons had shifted since we were young. She told me she'd seen a cardinal land on my mailbox that morning. "Red as sunset," she said. "They say that's a sign someone's watching over you." "Maybe," I said, smiling faintly, "or maybe it's just a bird who liked the color of the marigolds." She laughed softly, and the sound carried through the house like forgiveness. Before she left, I walked her to the door. The porch light caught her face in a soft halo. "You're a good man, Tom," she said quietly. "Whatever it is you're preparing for, I hope it gives you peace." "I think it already has," I said. That night I sat in the study again. The window was open, the air smelled like wet earth and cooling wood. I opened the small box where I kept your mother's wedding ring, the one she took off before her final hospital stay. It glimmered faintly under the desk lamp, a quiet promise still unbroken. I placed it in a smaller envelope and added a note. "For Emily, you remind me of her more than you know. May this help you remember what love was meant to be, not what it became." For Mark, I left the old watch he'd admired as a boy. Its hands still ticked, though faintly. Inside, I tucked a folded scrap of paper that read, "Time is not a currency, son. Spend it where it can be felt." For Luke, I left the fishing knife we'd used that one summer by the lake. He'd been afraid of the hook then, but he'd laughed harder than anyone when I caught nothing all day. My note to him said, "Don't let quiet make you believe you're alone. The best things grow in silence first." When I was done, I set the 3 envelopes side by side on the desk. A strange calm filled the room, not relief, not sorrow, just the stillness that comes when everything finally has a place to belong. The last thing I did was turn on the small recorder beside me. Its red light blinked once, steady and patient. I looked at it for a long while before speaking. "All right," I whispered. "Let's tell them the truth. The morning I left this world didn't feel any different from the ones before it. That's the thing about endings, most of them don't announce themselves. They just arrive quietly, wearing the face of an ordinary day. The sun hadn't fully risen yet. The sky wore that fragile shade between blue and gray, and the house still breathed in its half-sleep rhythm. The clock ticking, the fridge humming. The air just cool enough to make my joints ache a little when I stood. I boiled water for tea like I always did. The sound of the kettle was softer that morning, as if even it knew to whisper. The marigolds outside had bloomed early that week. I could see them through the window, bright little suns defying the stillness of dawn. A thin layer of dew clung to their petals, each drop holding the reflection of a world that was already moving on. I thought of Martha then. She'd probably be up soon, feeding her cat, watering those stubborn lilacs of hers. I smiled at the thought. Good people never realize how much light they lend to the corners of others' lives. I sat down at the kitchen table with my cup. The chair creaked the same way it always had, a familiar sound like a reminder that some things are meant to endure noise. On the table lay 3 envelopes, neatly stacked, sealed, and labeled, one for each of my children. Beside them, a small folded note for Martha. She would find it when the time came. A simple thank you for being the last kindness this house ever knew. The USB drive rested next to them, glinting faintly in the early light. Inside it, my confession waited, the story of who I was, who they had been, and the truth we had all tried too hard to forget. The pen I'd used the night before still lay open. A thin line of ink had bled onto the paper beneath it, curling like a signature that couldn't stop writing itself. I touched it gently. The paper felt cold. After finishing my tea, I walked to the porch. The air smelled faintly of rain, though the clouds had cleared. A robin sang somewhere nearby, its notes uneven, as if even the birds had mornings where their voices cracked. I eased myself into the wicker chair, the one where I'd sat through every season, storms, sun, and silence. It welcomed me one last time without protest. My breathing was slower now, not strained, just heavy, like my body had finally caught up with the years I'd been carrying. The sky shifted again, light bleeding gently through the trees. I closed my eyes for a moment, and the world behind them filled with the sound of younger days, children laughing in the yard, your mother's voice calling them in for supper, the clatter of plates, the way sunlight spilled across the floor like forgiveness. It was all still there. Every sound, every face. Nothing truly disappears, it just moves into quieter rooms. The phone on the counter buzzed once. A message. Mark, probably something about work or checking in. I didn't go inside to read it. Some messages are meant to be unanswered. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of lilac from across the street. That was how I knew Martha was awake. Somewhere behind her curtains, she was probably humming that same tune again, the one I never could name. I thought of my children then, not as they were now, busy, distracted, but as they had once been. Mark, his front teeth missing, running barefoot through the yard. Emily standing on a stool to stir pancake batter, flour on her cheeks. Luke asleep against my chest, breathing in rhythm with my heartbeat. I remembered thinking, this is it. This is what life is for, and maybe even now it still was. The first touch of warmth brushed my face. The sun had finally risen, and the light slipped across the porch, reaching me where I sat. It felt like a hand I used to know. My chest tightened slightly, not pain exactly, more like a sigh that had been waiting a lifetime to be released. I leaned back, listening to the creak of the chair blend with the hum of the world waking up. The sounds became distant after that. The birds, the breeze, the soft rattle of the wind chimed near the steps. Everything slowed, as if the day itself was pausing out of respect. I didn't feel fear, only a spreading calm, like the moment between waves when the ocean holds its breath. I thought of the words I'd recorded the night before, how I'd spoken to them each by name, not as a father disappointed, but as a man grateful for having known love in any form. My last words on that tape had been simple. Family isn't what you inherit, it's what you choose to keep. Now, as the light grew stronger and the world began its day, I let that line play again in my mind, like a prayer whispered not to God but to memory. A soft warmth spread across my fingers. The teacup slipped gently from my grasp, landing on the porch with a muted thud. The last of the steam vanished into the morning air. Somewhere in the distance, a door creaked open, Martha's maybe. Her voice called faintly across the yard. Tom. But by then, the house, the garden, the sky, they had all gone quiet. The news traveled faster than love ever had. A call from the hospital, a message left on a voicemail, a neighbor's trembling voice saying words that didn't quite land at first. By the time the siblings understood what had happened, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the house, his house, stood waiting at the end of the road. Lights still off, porch still swaying with the memory of him. Mark was the first to arrive. His car door slammed harder than necessary, a sound sharp enough to make the marigolds shiver. He moved quickly as though speed could disguise remorse. His tie hung loose around his neck. His eyes were wide and glassy, the kind of eyes that only look for proof that time can rewind. The front door creaked open easily. He hadn't locked it. He never did. The smell hit him first, tea leaves, rain-soaked wood, and something faintly metallic like old coins or cold air. The silence that followed was enormous. He called out, "Dad," once, then again, nothing, only the sound of the clock ticking somewhere deeper in the house. Emily arrived a few minutes later, her heels clicking too fast on the porch steps, her breath uneven from both rushing and denial. She clutched her phone in one hand like a shield, as though it could still summon control into a space that had none left. When she saw Mark standing in the living room, she froze. "Where is he?" she whispered. Mark didn't answer. He didn't have to. The shape of the truth was already written across his face. She pressed her fingers to her lips, as if trying to hold the world in place before it fell apart. Luke came last. No rush, no dramatics, just a steady walk from the truck to the porch. His shoulders soaked from rain, his face pale in the half-light. He paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame for a long moment before he entered. There was something different in his eyes. Not shock, not disbelief. Just the quiet recognition of something he had always known would happen without him. They found him in the chair on the porch, the teacup still on the ground, the faint trail of steam long gone. His face was peaceful, almost too peaceful, the kind that made Emily sob because it didn't look tragic enough. Mark knelt beside him, touching his father's hand with hesitation, as if the cold might spread. Luke stood behind them, silent, jaw tight. No one spoke for a while. The only sound was the wind brushing through the marigolds, the same ones their father had planted, their color defiant even in the dim. When the paramedics came, they moved with the kind of practiced gentleness that people reserve for strangers. They spoke in low tones, checked a pulse they already knew was gone, covered the body with a sheet that looked too white for this house. Mark tried to stay composed, talking too much, asking procedural questions no one needed answers to. Emily kept wiping her face, smearing mascara into the soft lines around her eyes. Luke stood near the porch rail, his hand gripping the wood so tightly that his knuckles turned white. When they lifted the stretcher into the van, Martha appeared across the street. Her hair was uncombed, her robe drawn tight. She didn't cry, she just watched. And when the van door closed, she whispered, "I told him he should have called you sooner." The siblings looked at her but said nothing, because deep down they knew the truth. He had called, just not with a phone. He had called in every quiet moment they had ignored. After the ambulance drove away, they went back inside. The house felt both familiar and foreign, like a language they'd once spoken fluently but had since forgotten. Mark wandered to the study, his shoes tracking bits of mud across the old rug. On the desk lay the envelopes, 3 of them side by side, their names written in his careful hand. "Dad left these," Mark said, his voice small. He picked one up, the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. Emily stepped closer. "What are they?" "Letters," he said. "I think they are for us." Luke didn't move. He stared at the sealed envelopes, his throat tightening at the sight of his name in his father's handwriting. He remembered how long it had been since he'd seen it, since any of them had. None of them opened their envelopes that night. Not because they wanted to wait, but because none of them were ready to hear what silence had been trying to tell them. Instead, they sat in the living room, 3 grown children surrounded by the artifacts of the man they once called home. The clock ticked steadily in the background, and the house, for the first time in years, was full again, but not with life, with consequence. Emily ran her hand over the couch fabric, her fingers catching on a tear in the seam. She whispered, "He was here, alone." "For how long?" Mark said nothing. Luke finally answered, "For as long as we let him be." The words fell heavy, like something breaking that couldn't be fixed. Martha came over with tea later because that's what she did, fill the spaces others were too ashamed to. She didn't ask permission. She just set the tray down and poured 3 cups. "I was with him a few days ago," she said softly. "He seemed peaceful, said he was getting things ready." "What things?" Emily asked. Martha hesitated. "You'll see soon enough." She looked at each of them kindly but firmly. "Whatever he left behind, it's not about money. He wanted you to understand something." Then she stood, smoothed the front of her coat, and left them there, 3 cups of tea growing cold between the ghosts of what they never said. Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds broke open just enough for a thin silver light to spill through. It hit the marigolds by the steps, making them glow faintly against the dark soil. The siblings sat in silence, each holding a cup, each afraid to drink. In the stillness, the clock ticked toward midnight, marking the exact moment. Their father's love finally found its way back to them, too late to answer, but not too late to be heard. The law office sat at the corner of Maple and 3rd, a narrow building of brick and shadow. Rain had returned that morning, fine as mist, brushing the windows like breath. Inside, the air smelled faintly of paper, coffee, and something metallic, perhaps the taste of nerves hanging in the room. Mark stood by the window, his reflection blurred by the drizzle outside. He checked his watch, though there was nothing to wait for anymore. Emily sat stiffly on the couch, legs crossed, phone silent in her lap. Luke leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, eyes lowered. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The tension in that small room was language enough. The door opened softly, and Harold Davis, the family lawyer, entered, carrying a thin brown folder. His coat was damp at the shoulders, his silver hair slightly askew. He nodded to them each in turn. "Thank you for coming," he said, voice quiet, almost reverent. "I know this isn't easy." Emily managed a polite nod. Mark murmured something resembling agreement. Luke just looked up once, then back at the floor. Harold placed the folder on the desk, sat down, and folded his hands over it. "Your father left very clear instructions," he began. "He wanted this reading to be handled privately, just the 3 of you and one other person." The siblings exchanged puzzled glances. Mark frowned. "What other person?" Harold hesitated for a moment, then gestured toward the doorway. A soft knock followed. When the door opened, Martha stepped inside. Her hair was tied neatly back, her hands clasped around a small purse. She looked uncertain, almost apologetic. I was asked to be here," she said quietly. Her voice trembled slightly, like someone stepping into a room where grief still lingers. Emily's eyes narrowed. Why would she be here? Harold's tone remained steady. Because Mr. Warren requested it. Mark crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. Requested it, he barely knew her. Harold met his gaze evenly. With respect, that's not entirely accurate. Silence thickened in the air. The rain outside tapped harder against the glass, as if punctuating the space between each unspoken thought. Harold opened the folder. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and began reading. This is the last will and testament of Thomas Warren, dated March 17th of this year. Emily's hand twitched slightly at the mention of the date. That was only a few weeks before he passed. The lawyer continued, voice calm but deliberate. First, Mr. Warren wished to express his gratitude to his children for the life he was able to live and for the lessons learned in both joy and disappointment. Mark exhaled sharply. Here we go. Harold glanced up, not unkindly but firmly, then continued. Second, he has directed that certain personal items be distributed individually, items of sentimental value accompanied by letters. Your father left personal letters at the house. After this reading, you'll retrieve them there. Luke's eyes flickered toward the folder, then back down. Third, Harold said, regarding the estate, including the house, the savings accounts, and all remaining assets, Mr. Warren has made specific arrangements that may come as unexpected. A long pause. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath. Mark leaned forward, the edge of irritation sharpening his tone. Let's just get to it. Harold nodded once, then read the next line slowly, clearly, as if each word were chosen to cut and to heal at the same time. I, Thomas Warren, being of sound mind and body, hereby leave my estate in its entirety to Martha Collins, my neighbor and friend, whose kindness in my final years reminded me of what family is meant to be. For a moment, no one moved. The sound of rain on the window filled the space, each drop like a heartbeat echoing against disbelief. Emily blinked as though the air itself had betrayed her. Mark's mouth fell open, then closed again, his face reddening, jaw tightening like a fist. What the hell is this? He snapped. That's not, there's no way he wouldn't. Harold raised a hand gently. I assure you, Mr. Warren, it's entirely legitimate. Your father met with me personally. The documents are signed, witnessed, and certified. Emily's voice cracked when she finally spoke. She manipulated him, she must have. Look at her. Martha's eyes filled, but she said nothing. She held her purse tightly, the leather creaking under her fingers. I never, she began softly, but Mark cut her off. You expect us to believe that our father just gave everything away to his neighbor. Harold closed the folder. There's more, he said quietly. Mr. Warren also left a recording, a video statement to accompany the will. He asked that it be played today here with all of you present. Emily wiped her eyes, her anger trembling beneath the surface. I don't want to hear it, she muttered. But Luke, still silent until then, spoke for the first time. We should, he said, voice low but firm. It's what he wanted. Mark glared at him but said nothing more. Harold nodded, retrieved a small USB drive from the folder, and inserted it into the monitor on his desk. The screen flickered to life, a faint hum, a flash of color, then the image of their father appeared. He sat in his study, the same desk behind him, the same marigolds visible through the window in soft bloom. For a moment the room forgot to breathe. Their father looked directly into the camera. His face was calm, eyes tired but clear. When he spoke, his voice filled the room, steady, deliberate, carrying the kind of weight that only truth can hold. If you're hearing this, he began, it means my words have outlived my presence, and that's all right. Some truths need silence to be heard. Martha lowered her eyes. Emily's hand froze mid-motion, her phone forgotten on her lap. Mark's face, tight with disbelief, softened just slightly. Luke sat perfectly still. The rain outside eased to a whisper, and as the recording continued, the room began to listen, not just with their ears, but with the parts of themselves that had been waiting too long to be forgiven. On the screen, the old man looked smaller than they remembered. His shoulders sagged beneath a sweater that had once been navy but now looked like washed-out twilight. The study around him glowed in the gentle amber of the desk lamp. Every book, every frame, every silent object bore witness. I imagine the room feels tense right now, his voice said, carrying that dry humor that used to settle arguments. Mark, you're probably standing with your arms crossed. Emily, I can almost see you rolling your eyes. And Luke, you'll be quiet, but you'll be listening. Emily's breath caught in her throat. Mark's jaw tightened. Luke looked down, blinking fast as though those words reached somewhere no one else could see. Father continued, voice even unhurried. If I could, I'd rather be there with you. But maybe this is the only way you'll actually let me finish a sentence. Harold, the lawyer, glanced up for a moment. The corner of his mouth twitched, something between sadness and admiration. The image flickered slightly, the faint hum of old speakers trembling through the air. You're here to learn what I've decided about the house, the accounts, the things you've all been taught to call mine. The truth is, I've come to see that nothing truly belongs to us, only to time, and to those who treat it kindly. The pause that followed was long enough for the ticking clock in the office to grow loud again. So, let's be clear, he said. I've chosen to leave everything, the house, the savings, the land, to Martha Collins. The name landed in the room like a stone thrown into still water. The echo of it rippled through every breath. Emily gasped audibly, her voice breaking into disbelief. What did he just say? Mark rose halfway from his chair, his pulse jumped visible at his temple. This is insane, he muttered. He's out of his mind, he must have been manipulated. Luke didn't move. He stared at the screen the way a person watches a flame consume something they'd forgotten was flammable. Harold cleared his throat softly. Please, he said, let's allow the video to finish. But the words did little to calm the storm that had begun. Emily turned sharply toward Martha, her voice sharp enough to slice through the tension. You knew about this, didn't you? You must have known. Martha's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her face had gone pale. She shook her head once, then twice, slowly, helplessly. I didn't, she whispered. I swear to you I didn't. But neither of them was listening. Mark took a step closer, anger trembling beneath every word. My father worked his entire life for this. This house, this was our home, and now some neighbor just gets it all. Harold raised a hand, calm but firm. Mr. Warren anticipated your reaction, he said softly, and he asked that I play this next part without interruption. He pressed a key on the remote and the screen flickered again. The father's voice returned, steadier now but softer, almost tender. If you're angry, that's all right. I would be too if I didn't understand. But I want you to listen, really listen. Martha didn't take anything from you. She gave me what I'd been missing long before the end, company, care, and honesty that asked for nothing back. Mark's breathing quickened. Emily stared, her eyes glassy with the confusion of grief and pride colliding. This isn't punishment, his voice continued. It's perspective. The things you inherit aren't always the ones written in a document. You've inherited my stubbornness, my hope, my temper, my humor. You've inherited the part of me that wants to be seen, but somewhere along the way we stopped seeing each other. Luke swallowed hard. A muscle twitched at the edge of his mouth. He pressed his palms together in his lap, the sound of his father's words tightening the space between every heartbeat. Mark stood rigid by the desk now, staring down at the lawyer. This can't stand, he said flatly. I'll contest it. He wasn't thinking straight. Harold met his gaze. It was very clear. He made the decision after consulting with both myself and a notary. He recorded this message the same day he signed. Emily's voice cracked, rising like a cry that didn't know where to land. But why her? He barely had us over, and he just gives everything to a stranger. Martha flinched as though struck, her eyes glistening but steady. She didn't defend herself. She didn't move. Harold let the recording continue. Mark, Emily, Luke. The father's voice said softly, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking this is betrayal. But betrayal only exists where love still lives. And I loved you more than my own breath. I just can't leave you things that will make you forget what truly matters. The screen glowed faintly against their faces. For the first time, Mark's anger faltered. He blinked rapidly, eyes glistening. You may hate me for this, the father said, but someday when the noise fades, I hope you'll understand why a man gives his home not to blood, but to kindness. The video froze on his face, his eyes soft, his mouth just beginning to curve into something like a smile. No one spoke for a long time. The rain outside had stopped, but the air still carried its weight. Mark paced the room once, his footsteps sharp against the wooden floor. Emily wiped at her face with trembling fingers. Luke sat still, his expression unreadable. Martha's hand stayed folded tightly in her lap. Her pulse beat fast beneath the paper-thin skin on her wrist. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "This isn't over," he said. He turned to Harold. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." Harold nodded once, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the frozen image on the screen. It was as if the man in the video was still watching them, not judging, not forgiving, just waiting for them to finally listen. Luke rose quietly, walked to the monitor, and placed a hand against the frame. For a moment, his reflection merged with his father's face. He whispered something no one could hear, then he turned away. The monitor glowed in the dim office, its pale light washing across their faces like cold dawn. The USB had already played the will, the shock of inheritance still hung thick in the air, but Harold reached over now and clicked another file. "This," he said quietly, "was separate from the legal message. Your father asked that it be played only after the will had been read." No one replied. He pressed enter. The sound crackled first, a soft distortion, the kind that comes when time itself has weight. Then the image appeared, the same room, the same man, but the tone different. This wasn't the calm, deliberate recording of a will. This was personal. His voice trembled at first as though it had taken him several tries to begin. "If you're seeing this," he said, "then the papers are signed and what's done is done. But I didn't want the story to end in signatures and silence. There are things I never managed to say when I was alive, maybe because I didn't know how, or maybe because I thought there'd always be more time." The image flickered once. Behind him, the light from the window had softened, the marigolds barely visible in the background, swaying against a late afternoon glow. Mark's breathing grew shallow. Emily folded her arms tightly, and Luke leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his eyes fixed on the screen. "When your mother passed," the father continued, "I promised her I'd keep this family together. But a promise isn't enough when love turns into obligation. I tried to call, I tried to visit, but there's only so many ways a person can ask to be remembered." Emily's eyes glistened. She looked down, pressing her lips together until the color left them. Mark shifted uncomfortably, as though the words were aimed straight through him. The father's tone softened, like he was talking not to them as they were now, but to the children they used to be. "Mark, I know you worked hard. I know the world taught you that success is proof of worth, but I wish you'd seen how much I admired you even when you thought I didn't. You became everything I hoped you'd be, and maybe that's why I stopped feeling needed." Mark blinked rapidly. His throat bobbed, a quiet sound escaping, part laugh, part ache. "Emily," he said next, his voice almost breaking on her name, "you were the heart of this house. The one who felt everything too deeply, who wanted to fix what she couldn't understand. Somewhere along the way that heart learned to protect itself. I don't blame you for that, but I wish you'd known that love doesn't always ask to be efficient." Emily covered her mouth. Her shoulders trembled. The faint scent of her perfume, once overpowering, now hung fragile in the stale air like something fading before anyone could hold it. "And Luke," he said, his voice quiet but warm, "you were my silence. You taught me what it meant to listen. You didn't talk much, but when you did, it was always kind, always honest. I hope you never mistake gentleness for weakness. The world will try to, but don't let it." Luke exhaled slowly, his eyes fixed on the screen but unfocused, as though seeing both the man and the boy inside himself at once. "I didn't make this recording to justify the will," the father went on. "I know how it looks. I can already hear the arguments, the disbelief, the anger. But this wasn't about choosing someone else over you. It was about giving thanks to someone who reminded me what family still felt like when I'd nearly forgotten." The camera shifted slightly, a small shake as though his hand had brushed the desk. He leaned closer, eyes glinting with something raw and unguarded. "Martha came by on my birthday with pie. Just pie. No expectations, no questions, no talk of inheritance or obligation. She sat with me for an hour, and in that hour, I remembered what your mother's voice sounded like when she laughed. She didn't replace any of you. She reminded me how to forgive you." Martha's breath hitched quietly across the table. She pressed her fingers to her lips, eyes shining with the grief of being seen when she hadn't asked to be. The father leaned back, his hands folded in front of him, his expression softening into something almost peaceful. "I left her the house because it will be lived in, not sold, because she promised to turn it into a place where others could rest, people who have no one waiting for them. That way maybe the walls will keep doing what I couldn't, make someone feel like they still belong somewhere. The silence that followed those words was unbearable. No one dared move. Even Harold, the lawyer, kept his head bowed slightly. The father's tone grew lighter, almost wistful. "I've written you each a letter," he said. "Not to explain myself, but to remind you of what you've already known. You'll find them with my things. Take your time reading them. Grief has its own schedule." He smiled faintly then, that half-smile that used to follow a joke no one else found funny. "And if you're angry," he said, "good. Anger means you still care. Just don't let it be the last thing you feel." The image flickered once more. He took a breath, looked straight into the camera, and for a heartbeat it felt as though he could see them sitting there. "Family," he said quietly, "isn't about who stays the longest. It's about who shows up when everyone else forgets to." Then the screen went black. The room remained frozen in that silence that only follows the truth. Mark's breathing was ragged now. Emily's cheeks glistened, her fingers trembling as she reached for a tissue that wasn't there. Luke sat still, his lips pressed together, the faintest tremor passing through his jaw. Martha stared at the blank screen, her hands shaking slightly in her lap. No one moved to turn it off. Because somehow, for the first time in years, they were all listening, not to each other, but to him. The screen went dark, but no one moved. It was as if time itself had paused, the air in the office holding steady, heavy, filled with the echo of a man who had already said his final words. Mark was the first to break. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The sound was harsh, violent, too alive in a room that had just been speaking to the dead. "This is manipulation," he said, his voice trembling with the kind of certainty that only exists to hide confusion. "He wasn't well, he must have been coerced." No one answered. Emily stared at the screen, her reflection faintly visible in its black surface, a face she almost didn't recognize, softened not by sorrow but by shame. Luke sat still, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped like someone praying for clarity rather than comfort. Harold folded his glasses slowly, laying them on the desk before him. "I know this is difficult," he said quietly, "but your father was sound of mind. I spoke with him myself more than once. He wanted you to see this for what it was." "And what exactly was it?" Mark snapped. "Some sort of performance, a lesson. You think we deserve this?" Harold looked at him, not with judgment but with something closer to sorrow. "I think," he said, "he believed you still had something to learn." Emily turned then, her voice breaking through the silence. "What did he mean about Martha and the house being a place for others?" Harold hesitated. Then he reached into the folder again and pulled out a letter, folded neatly, edges worn from being handled often. He slid it across the table toward her. "Your father left this with his instructions," he said. "It explains the rest." Emily stared at it for a moment before unfolding it, the paper whispering like breath against her trembling hands. Her father's handwriting filled the page, strong, deliberate strokes that carried the weight of a man who still meant what he wrote. "By the time you read this, you'll have seen the video. I know it hurt, but the truth always hurts before it heals." The words blurred slightly as tears welled in her eyes. She blinked hard and continued reading aloud, her voice soft, uneven. "Martha didn't just bring me pie. She brought strangers. Men from the shelter downtown, women from the halfway house near the church. They'd help me fix the fence, paint the porch, plant the marigolds. They weren't looking for money. They were looking for somewhere to belong." Emily's hand fell to her lap. The others leaned closer, listening. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a muffled quiet, as if the world itself had leaned in too. "She told me once that kindness is a kind of inheritance, that when you give it away, it finds its way back to someone who needs it next." Mark swallowed, his throat dry. He remembered the marigolds, how they always bloomed even when the soil looked tired and unkind. Emily's voice trembled again. "So I asked her to keep the house alive, not as a monument, but as a shelter, for those who have no one left to remember their name. The rooms will hold laughter again, not ours, but someone's. That's enough for me." She stopped reading. The paper slipped slightly in her hand, and for a moment the sound of her breath was the only thing left moving in the room. Martha had been silent all this time, sitting small in the corner, her eyes red but dry. Now she spoke, her voice fragile yet certain. "He asked me to promise," she said quietly, "to turn the house into something good. We've already begun, a few volunteers from the shelter are helping. It'll be called the Warren Home. He wanted it to be a place where no one ever feels forgotten." Mark sat down again slowly, anger shrinking into something quieter, heavier. He looked at her, not with accusation this time, but with the uncomfortable weight of truth. Emily pressed the letter against her chest. Luke leaned back in his chair, eyes glistening in the dim light. Harold spoke again, barely above a whisper. "There's one more thing." He reached for a small, sealed envelope tucked in the folder's back pocket. "This was labeled for all three of you. He asked that it be opened after you knew everything." Luke took it, broke the seal carefully, and unfolded the single sheet inside. It was written in the same neat hand. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only ask that you understand what I've done is not a rejection, it's a reminder. You've all built walls around your lives. I only hope this house, our house, can be a door for someone else." Luke's lips parted, a slow exhale breaking through him like release. "You can still visit. The garden will always be open. Sit there when you miss me. The wind will do the rest." The silence that followed wasn't empty this time. It was full of memory, of regret, of the strange tenderness that comes when love finally speaks without defense. Mark rubbed his face with both hands, his shoulders trembling. "I thought he'd stopped caring," he said hoarsely. "I thought he'd given up on us." Emily shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "He just gave up waiting for us to come back." Martha looked down at her hands, the letter's last words still hanging in the air. Luke rose first, crossing to the window. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart, thin lights spilling across the wet pavement. He spoke without turning around. "I think he found peace," he said softly. "And I think maybe this is how we start to earn ours." No one argued. The room, for the first time in years, felt like family again, not whole, but honest. The reading of the will had ended the night before, but its echoes hadn't stopped. Even sleep refused to come, as if the father's voice still drifted somewhere above the silence, resting in the corners of their minds. When morning came, the siblings gathered again, this time not out of duty, but because none of them knew where else to go. The lawyer's office was behind them. Now it was just the three of them, standing before the house they'd all once called home. The gate creaked when Mark pushed it open. The marigolds lining the path were in full bloom, their bright heads swaying gently in the breeze, unaware of the storm that had passed through the hearts of those who now approached them. For the first time, none of them argued about who should walk in first. They entered together. The house smelled the same, lemon polish, dust, and the faint sweetness of old wood, but it also felt different. Not smaller, not emptier, just awake. Emily paused in the hallway, her fingertips brushing the framed photographs along the wall. There she was, 6 years old, missing a front tooth and holding her father's hand. He was smiling at her, not the camera. She hadn't noticed that before. Luke stopped near the kitchen. The chair his father had used sat by the window, a faint indentation still marking where he'd leaned every morning. The teacup, washed and put away, gleamed faintly in the cupboard light. He could almost hear the faint scrape of ceramic on wood. Mark went straight to the study. He hadn't been able to enter it since the day their father passed, but now something pulled him there. The air inside was cooler, quieter. The old typewriter still sat in the corner, its keys gathering dust like tiny forgotten graves. On the desk he found the envelopes, the ones they hadn't yet opened, each labeled in his father's handwriting. Their names. No titles, no terms of affection, just truth. Mark sat down heavily, the envelope trembling in his hand. He tore it open. Inside was a single sheet folded twice. He read silently, his eyes moving slowly across the words. "My son, I spent too long trying to teach you how to build a future, and not enough time showing you how to live one. I know the world taught you that love is something to be earned. But the truth is, it's what you give when there's nothing left to prove." Mark's jaw tightened. He folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest before sliding it back into the envelope. No tears came, only the weight of something that felt like forgiveness trying to find its way in. In the kitchen, Emily opened hers. Her voice wavered as she read under her breath. "You were always my mirror, beautiful, strong, and far too hard on yourself. You tried to become what others needed, and in doing so forgot how to simply be. I hope you find softness again. The world has enough people trying to be strong." She held the letter close, her shoulders shaking quietly. Through the window, she saw Martha outside, tending to the garden, her hands gentle among the flowers her father once loved. For the first time, Emily didn't feel resentment when she looked at her, only gratitude, and a faint ache that it had taken loss to see kindness clearly. Luke sat last at the porch where his father had taken his final breath. He opened his envelope with slow, deliberate care. "You understood silence, Luke. That was your gift. The world will mistake it for indifference, let them. Just promise me you'll speak when love needs defending. Quiet hearts still carry the loudest truths." Luke folded the letter once more, looked out at the yard, and whispered into the wind, "I will, Dad." By afternoon, the three of them gathered again at the kitchen table, the same one that had once held birthday cakes, arguments and laughter that shook the windows. Now it held 3 letters and one fragile piece. Mark cleared his throat first. "So the house stays with Martha," he said, not as a question but a statement. Emily nodded. "She's keeping his promise, that's what matters." Luke looked at both of them. "We could still help her," he said. His tone was quiet but certain. "She shouldn't have to do it alone. Maybe that's how we make it right." Mark hesitated. He rubbed his thumb against the edge of the table. His pride rose like a reflex. Then, for the first time in years, he let it fall. "Yeah," he said softly. "Maybe it's time we start fixing something we didn't finish breaking." That evening, Martha joined them. She stood by the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron. "You don't have to stay," she said gently. "I know it's not easy being here." Emily smiled faintly. We should." Mark nodded, avoiding her gaze but meaning every word. Luke just began helping her carry the flower pots from the porch inside. As the 4 of them worked, the sun dipped low, pouring soft gold over the wooden floor. Dust motes shimmered in the air, like fragments of memory finally free to move again. The house, once a monument to silence, filled slowly with the sounds of voices, awkward at first, then easier. The scrape of chairs, the clink of dishes, the faint hum of laughter finding its way back. When the last of the light faded, they stood together by the porch, looking out over the marigolds swaying gently in the dusk. Martha's voice broke the quiet. "He said the garden would tell you when he was proud." Emily looked down, and for a moment the petals seemed brighter, as if the flowers themselves were glowing from within. None of them spoke after that. There was no need. The air was full of what had finally been understood. The father had not left them behind. He had simply left them a way back to each other. The Warren house stood bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. The marigolds glowed like tiny suns along the porch rail, their petals trembling gently in the breeze. It had been 3 months since the will reading, and though time had softened the sharpest edges of grief, the house still breathed with the weight of memory. Inside, the rooms were no longer empty. Footsteps echoed again. Laughter, cautious at first, had begun to return, like a song slowly remembered after years of silence. Martha had kept her promise. The living room now held mismatched chairs and a long wooden table where strangers shared meals and stories. The scent of soup, fresh bread, and wildflowers lingered in the air. Each evening the front door stayed open a little longer, because that's what the house had become, a door that never truly closed. And surprisingly, the Warren children had kept their promise too. Mark had come back first. He started by helping repaint the porch, his movements stiff, uncertain, as if each brushstroke carried an apology he didn't know how to speak. He worked quietly side by side with Martha, and though they exchanged few words, something in the rhythm of work, the scrape of brush, the smell of paint, the sound of birds, mended what conversation could not. Luke began visiting on weekends. He fixed the garden fence, built new shelves for the pantry, taught the younger volunteers how to hammer straight. Sometimes he'd pause by the marigold, just watching them sway, his father's words echoing softly in his mind. Quiet hearts carry the loudest truths. Emily was the last to return. At first she only brought supplies, canned food, blankets, medicine. But one afternoon she stayed. She helped serve lunch to the guests, a group of tired men and women from the nearby shelter. When one of them thanked her through tears, she realized that for the first time in years, she was exactly where she needed to be. Together, the 3 siblings rebuilt what they didn't know they'd lost. Not wealth, not status, but the simple, steady pulse of connection. They didn't always agree. Old wounds still ached in certain silences, but grief, when tended gently, has a way of turning into grace. And through grace, they began to see what their father had truly meant. One evening, as the sky turned violet over the horizon, Martha gathered them in the study. The old typewriter still sat there, dusted and polished, the same desk where their father had written his letters. "I found something," she said softly, holding up a small envelope that had fallen behind the drawer. It was sealed, marked only with 2 words, "For after." She handed it to Mark, and for a moment none of them moved. Then he opened it carefully. Inside was a folded sheet of paper, thin, yellowed, but written in that familiar, steady hand. He began to read aloud. "If this letter has found you, it means the house is full again. It means the marigolds have bloomed. It means I was right to believe that love, even neglected, never truly dies." They all looked at each other. No one spoke. "I've thought a lot about what it means to leave something behind. Most people think inheritance is measured in property or money. But what I've learned is that the only thing worth leaving is the part of yourself that teaches others how to care." Emily's eyes filled with tears, her hand pressed over her mouth. "If you've returned here, then you've already found what I hoped you would. Not forgiveness, but understanding, because forgiveness is about the past. Understanding is what saves the future." Luke's breath caught. Mark set the letter down for a moment, his fingers trembling slightly. Then he continued, "You don't owe me anything. You don't need to live the way I did, or believe the things I believed. Just carry forward one truth: that family isn't defined by blood, but by the love that chooses to stay." Martha's head bowed, her eyes wet with quiet gratitude. She didn't interrupt. "If someday this house holds laughter again, if a stranger finds comfort within its walls, if the marigolds bloom for someone who has no one, then that, my children, is my legacy." The letter ended with one last line. The ink pressed deeper into the page, as if he'd written it slowly, deliberately, so it could never fade. "The greatest inheritance you will ever have is the capacity to love." No one spoke for a long while after that. The only sound was the rustling of paper, the distant hum of evening cicadas, and the faint creak of the floor as the house seemed to breathe with them. Mark finally looked up, his eyes glistening with something that wasn't guilt anymore. "It feels like he's still here," he said quietly. Emily nodded. Luke smiled faintly. "Maybe he never left." Outside, the sky deepened into a bruised shade of indigo. The porch lights flickered on. A few guests from the shelter were tending the garden, their laughter floating through the open window. The house, once a place of silence, was alive again. Martha turned to them, her voice soft but steady. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "No," Mark replied, shaking his head. "He'd be proud of this." He gestured around to the laughter, the clatter of dishes, the soft hum of life returning. Later that night, when everyone else had gone to bed, Emily stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool, scented with rain and soil. She sat in the same chair where her father had taken his last breath, and whispered, "Thank you." Somewhere the wind shifted. A single marigold petal loosened, drifting down onto her lap. It felt like an answer. And that, my friends, was the story of the will reading the father who was forgotten. A story not about death, but about rediscovery, about how love, when left unspoken, doesn't vanish. It just waits for us to be quiet enough to hear it again. The father's greatest gift was never the house, nor the money, nor even the lessons he wrote in those final letters. His true inheritance, his true wealth, was the seed of empathy he left behind, the kind that grows only when watered with humility. And that's our lesson today. Maybe you're listening right now and thinking of someone you've drifted away from, a parent, a sibling, a friend you stopped calling because life got too loud. Maybe pride stood between you, or maybe you both just forgot how to talk. If this story teaches us anything, it's that silence is not peace. It's only distance waiting for courage. Reach out, call them, send that message. Don't wait for regret to make you realize what you still have time to say, because the greatest inheritance we can give or receive is presence. The willingness to show up, to forgive, to listen. Thank you for staying until the end of this journey. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need a reminder that love is not measured by what we leave behind, but by what we give while we're still here. May your days be gentle, your home filled with laughter, and your heart always open enough to recognize the treasures that can't be written in any will. Until next time, take care of yourself and the people you love.